Hello, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Shana Weiss. I am the Associate Director here at the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. We are thrilled to welcome Professor Haggai Ram for his talk today, A History of Weed Culture in Palestine-Israel, Ethnic, Gender, Class, and Gendered Perspectives. Haggai is a professor of history at the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at Ben Gurion University in the Negev in Israel. He received his doctorate from NYU, and he's been teaching at Ben Gurion University since 1995. His research and teaching focuses on the social and cultural histories of Iran and the Levant region, including Palestine-Israel. He's written many, many books, chapters, and articles. He is the author of Myth and Mobilization and Revolutionary Iran in 1994, Reading Iran and Israel, which came out in 2006 in Hebrew, Iranophobia, The Logic of an Israeli Obsession, which came out in 2009, and for us, most excitingly, his recent book, Intoxicating Zion, A Social History of Hashish, a Mandatory Palestine and Israel, which came out in 2020. He's also the editor-in-chief of Jama'a, a Hebrew language peer-reviewed journal of Middle Eastern studies. I want to remind us that all questions should come in through the chat feature. There's also a live transcript that is available and can be turned off individually. Professor Ram will speak for about 45 minutes, and then my colleague and our director, Professor Jonathan Sarna, will do the Q&A starting at about 12:55. So without further ado, thank you, Haggai.
Thank you so much for having me, and for all the people who've been involved in organizing this, Anna Simpson in particular. So yeah, let's rock and roll. I'll just share my. There we go. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that. So, 45 minutes, right? So let us begin. So my presentation here is based, at least in part, on the book, which was graciously just mentioned, Intoxicating Zion, Social History of Hashish in Mandatory Palestine and Israel, which was published late last year. The overall study was concerned with the previously untold history and social life of hashish in Palestine, Israel, the drug which is made from the cannabis resin. My story begins in the 1920s, the mandatory period in Palestine and the Levant in general, which coincided with the criminalization of cannabis and other drugs in the international arena. And it ends with the 1967 war, which, together with other local and global trends and circumstances, dramatically transformed patterns of drug policy and drug culture in Israel and the Levant region for years to come. It is a transnational, perhaps even global study that examines the transition from mandatory Palestine to the state of Israel in the 1950s, 1960s, through the perspective of hashish as an illicit commodity that is smuggled across borders, traded, consumed, regulated, and endlessly debated. And as a screen, I might say, a screen on which people project their class, ethnic, racial, and gendered desires and anxieties. Now, by way of another introduction, starting in the late 1990s, trained historians began to forge what drug historian Paul Gutenberg termed as the new drug history. Until that time, academic interest in criminalized drugs was largely limited to those in the biomedical or legal criminological fields. So when historians began to demonstrate an interest in the subject, they delved into previously untapped archives, analyzing a wide array of sources using cross-disciplinary cultural and sociological methods. So in the process, they have shed light on an immense, and I might add, fascinating field of study that includes, for example, new understandings of the political and cultural contexts within which substances became drugs, the underworlds of users and traffickers, the complex roles of race, gender, and class in the construction of addiction, and the place of colonialism and nation-building projects in dispersing drug use and enforcing drug restrictions. Now, historical research of these topics has offered, at least to my mind, exciting observations about a variety of societies in the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And perhaps more excitingly, it demonstrates the links between criminalized drugs on the one hand and broader political, social, and economic histories on the other. Now, as of late, there has been a trickle of monographs, articles, and dissertations on the history of drugs in the pre-modern, early modern, and modern Middle East, specifically, but not exclusively, Egypt, Morocco, the Ottoman Empire / Turkey, Lebanon, and Iran. With regard to Palestine-Israel specifically, no historical study of drugs in Palestine has ever been undertaken, and no academic attention, excuse me, has been paid to the links between criminalized drugs and broader historical issues in the state of Israel. Intoxicating Zion is the first study that addresses this lacuna, and it focuses on cannabis, which was and remains the main criminalized mind-altering substance that circulated in the Levant and the region's most popular recreational drug. So in my talk this afternoon, your afternoon, my evening, I would like to discuss three interrelated aspects of the social history of hashish in Mandatory Palestine and the State of Israel. The first is the movement. The first is hashish commodity chains and the movement of hashish traffickers across the interwar Levant, including Palestine. The second is the evolution of hashish culture in Mandatory Palestine. And the third is the attitudes of Jews in pre and post 1948 to cannabis and cannabis intoxication. In the process, the porous nature of the Levant states and the interdependence between them will become apparent, not only in matters relating to Levantine culture and political horizons, which have been sufficiently addressed in previous scholarship, but also in matters pertaining to criminal activity and leisure culture. By the same token, I hope to be able to demonstrate the extent to which a nebulous constellation of intersecting forms of colonial knowledge, medical and otherwise, latent class, racial, and gendered anxieties and colonial political agendas circulated around the globe, Palestine, Israel included, culminate in what I might describe as a fictitious understanding of the drug as an Oriental source of vice prone to innumerable pathologies. So let us begin. Contrary to 19th and 20th century Orientalist accounts hashish consumption in late Ottoman Palestine appears to have been very negligible. Now, it is indeed likely that hashish was consumed in Palestine in moderation, in much of the same way that opium was used moderately in 19th century England without any fatal loss of control, as it were. This, however, began to change with the establishment of unprecedented global controls over opiates before and during the interwar years, and over cannabis in the 1925 League of Nations Second Opium Convention. Before the emergence of these incipient drug control regimes, Greece was the main supply source of hashish to Egypt, which probably has one of the longest histories with hashish in the Arab Middle East, a history that dates back to the Middle Ages. Indeed, as Philip Robbins suggested, with a mixture of affection and mild contempt, to this day, Egyptians are widely referred to as hashishin, that is, hashish users, across the rest of the Arab world in recognition of their fondness for the drug. At any rate, without supplies from Greece, Egyptians turned for the first time to hashish supplies from Lebanon and Syria. As a result, Palestine emerged as a new junction and a transit route in the Levant hashish trade that extended between Lebanon in the north and Egypt in the south. In short, Palestine's geographical position ensured that vast quantities of illicit hashish supplies would be smuggled across its territory en route to Egypt. Now, according to Arjun Appadurai in his classic The Social Life of Things, the diversion of commodities from specified paths is always a sign of creativity or crisis, whether aesthetic or economic. Arguably, the diversion of hashish smuggling routes to Egypt from Greece to the Levant was a sign of crisis for the British in Palestine and a sign of creativity for hashish traffickers. Lacking the infrastructural ability, the economic capacity, and sometimes the willpower to enforce the ban on the drug trade, border crossing illicit hashish flows demonstrated to the British the porous nature of the Mandate States' borders, and by extension, they also questioned the very legitimacy of these states. Claude Scudamore Jarvis, a British major who served in the English army in Egypt and Palestine, conveyed this sentiment most succinctly. Complaining about the menace of hashish traffickers in the Levant region, he mused, and I quote, "Hashish smuggling is rather like an attempt to dam a stream with clay barrier. Directly you have plugged up one hole, the water comes through another place." On the other hand, the diversion of smuggling routes to the Levant compelled, or rather inspired, hashish traffickers to come up with the most creative and ingenious rouses and subterfuges in order to transport their cargoes freely or safely from Lebanon to Egypt via Palestine. Now, it should be remembered that the interwar period presented these hashish traffickers with serious challenges. Firstly, incipient international, regional, and local control efforts had criminalized these shady entrepreneurs. And secondly, as people who had previously, that is in the late Ottoman Empire, crossed territories in relative ease, the creation of the Levant Mandate States with customs and police outposts erected along these states' borders restricted their free movement, and they could no longer expect their now illicit or illegal cargoes to go undetected. So these inauspicious circumstances required our traffickers. Oh, and I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this before. When I say traffickers, I mean ordinary Palestinians, Arabs from adjacent countries, international gangs from different countries in Europe and the Middle East, British soldiers stationed in Palestine and Egypt, and significantly, and I won't have time to go into that, also Zionist paramilitary organizations that fought the British. So these inauspicious circumstances required all of these actors to come up with a variety of ploys and deceptions to transport their cargoes safely. So smugglers concealed hashish in shoes with thick hollow soles and heels, inside wheels, in hollow slabs of chocolate, in hollow sandwich loaves, in consignments of dried apricots, lemons, watermelons, and bananas, in sacks of potatoes, in egg cartons, in cases of olives, in book covers, in table legs, in toolboxes, in petrol tanks, on the bodies of men falsely dressed as monks and priests, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Significantly, though, in these ploys, hashish smugglers took advantage of and were empowered by what historian Paul Knepper described in the context of criminal activity in interwar Europe as world shrinking technologies, or in other words, speed technologies, products of the long 19th century. Our smugglers used cars, ships, trains, and even airplanes to ferry their illicit merchandise across borders. These, however, were employed alongside more traditional transportation means, such as camels and other beasts of burden. Smugglers would glue hashish cylinders underneath the hair of the camel's hump, or alternately, and please don't try this at home, they would force these cylinders down their throats. So once crossing the border into Egypt, the unfortunate beasts would then be slaughtered and the valuable cargoes recovered. One illuminating example of such ploys is transmitted in the 1994 novella Majma' al-Asrar, Bundle of Secrets, by the celebrated Lebanese novelist, playwright, and critic Elias Khoury. So one of the novella's protagonists is a certain Hana al-Salman, a convict in a Beirut prison in the 1940s who is awaiting his verdict, execution by hanging, for the killing of two prostitutes. Hana listens attentively to stories disclosed to him by Ahmad and Munir, his two cellmates. He is fascinated by their tales about the exploits of a certain Sami al-Khoury, not to be confused with the author, Elias Khoury, who is described in the novella, and I quote, as one of the most dangerous smugglers in the world of drugs, who is also known as the boss, Mu'allim in Arabic. The following cabbage story, which illustrated the boss's ingenuity and his, quote, amazing ability to escape police networks that pursued him, impressed Hana the most and stirred up his emotions. And the story goes like this. The boss instructed us, that is Munir and Ahmad, to saw cabbage. We thought he lost his mind. He said, obtain a plot of land and saw cabbage. We said, boss, we came here to eat bread. We are not farmers. He said, saw cabbage and the rest is on me. So we sawed. You know, when the cabbage starts growing, it's open. We kept watering the cabbage, looking around and not understanding. We were instructed to see to it that the cabbage would open. One moonless night, the boss arrived with 10 young men equipped with magnum revolvers and 10 trucks loaded with hashish. We took the hashish and planted it inside the open cabbage. We worked all night. The Rais, Sami, insisted on rolling up his sleeves. This wasn't a smuggling operation for him. This was a hobby. He planted hashish in between the cabbage leaves as though he were a physician giving medicine to a patient. After 10 days, which lasted like 100 years, the cabbage leaves had shut, covering the hashish and swallowing it up. I swear to Allah. After that, we collected the cabbage and sent it in cargo planes to Egypt under the pretense of a cabbage export deal. To be clear, the novella is primarily a work of fiction. However, like many other fictional works, it echoes a credible historical reality and demonstrates the extent to which the creation of the Levant hashish trade, stretching from Lebanon to Egypt with Palestine in between, provided a bonanza for many hashish traffickers, Lebanese and many others. The credibility of this tale is reinforced by the fact that Sami al-Khoury was indeed a real Lebanese drug baron, both during the interwar period and afterwards. In 1952, he was also described, and I quote, as the most powerful and notorious drug trafficker in Lebanon's young history. At an early stage of his career, he may have run hashish trafficking operations from Lebanon to Egypt along the lines recounted in Bundle of Secrets. As a matter of fact, as I discovered in the archives after reading the novella, in 1947, al-Khoury was imprisoned in Egypt for 3 years after attempting to smuggle 266 kilograms of hashish and 47 kilograms of opium on board an airplane which stopped over in Palestine for refueling. Let us move on to the evolution of hashish culture in Palestine. And for this, I would like to quote from Sebastian Conrad's famous book, What is Global History? And in that book, Conrad writes, and I quote, "The history of commodities traces particular items, most famously sugar, of course, as in the classic study of Sidney Mintz, but also cotton, soy, porcelain, glass, and I might add, drugs as well, across distant geographies and across time. These are studies of interconnectedness that link sites of production and consumption in different locations and show how these commodities impacted individual households as well as larger groups and social formations. Accordingly, what I would like to argue now is that the novel links that developed between the sites of hashish production in Lebanon, on the one hand, and the sites of hashish consumption in Egypt, on the other hand, led to a dramatic change in the leisure, culture, practices of Palestinian Arabs. You see, while Palestinian Arabs, as I mentioned, were not known to be avid hashish consumers in the late Ottoman period, the emergence of Palestine as the largest hashish depot in the Levant during the interwar years led to a surge of hashish smoking among them. My sources provide ample evidence that by the early 1930s, hashish smoking spread throughout Palestine's urban centers of Jaffa, Haifa, Jerusalem, Acre, Nablus, Tiberias, Ramla, Lida, and even Tel Aviv, the first Hebrew city, and many persons could be seen wandering the streets of these towns, utterly stoned. Venues of hashish consumptions were primarily of two kinds. The first was makeshift hashish dens, which the Hebrew and Arabic press of the time described as hashish smoking clubs, and coffee houses. What went on inside one such hashish den? A contemporary Jewish observer described what transpired in one such club, which was located in the Arab quarter of Haifa's lower city, as follows. Various people were either sitting down or lying down. Others were smoking hookahs, right, water pipes, and the rest were lying motionlessly as if dead. Their lips mumbled meaningless broken words and syllables. their faces glowing with silly smiles. Within 2 hours, all the guests were fast asleep. The only sounds were fleeting words and unintelligible roars coming out of the sleeping men's mouths. Be that as it may, hashish dens were not the main venues of hashish smoking in interwar Palestine. Like elsewhere in the Arab, Ottoman, Turkish, and Iranian Middle East, coffee houses were. This is not surprising. A Middle Eastern invention, coffee houses first appeared in the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Iran in the 16th and 17th centuries, soon emerging as urban venues where new kinds of sociability and new kinds of public conviviality came into play. From the perspective of drug history, one of the reasons why these institutions reached such a paramount social position is that they became a point of convergence of consumable intoxicants such as coffee, tobacco, opium, and cannabis. The combinations of all these enabled coffee house patrons to sip coffee leisurely while also pursuing collective pleasure in ingesting opium and hashish, and beginning in the 18th centuries, also smoking each of these mixed with tobacco, another intoxicant. So it is a known fact among historians of Palestine that coffee house culture had expanded dramatically in the interwar period. It is my contention that this expansion may have been linked to the emergence of Palestine as a major depot of hashish commodities in the Levant, as I discussed earlier. Indeed, it may not have been a coincidence that the recreational activities that were soon hosted in coffee houses in Palestine included, in addition to small-scale gambling, the performance of music and prostitution, the sale and consumption of tobacco and hashish. It is certain that hashish-serving cafes were a thorn in the side of the British authorities in Palestine, and that is why cafe patrons and cafe owners were regularly arrested due to hashish smoking and or hashish possession, and why from the 1930s onwards, the police conducted repeated coordinated raids on cafes in various towns at the same time. Now, conspicuously missing from drug smoking activities were Palestine's Jews, whose number had risen from 56,000 in the wake of World War I to 650,000 towards the end of the mandatory period. First, of course, there were Zionist values to be considered, as intoxication did not really sit well with a movement valorizing the virtues of abstemious frontier pioneering and Hebrew labor. Augmenting Jewish aversion to hashish was fear of over-assimilation into the Orient. Now, I say over-assimilation because Zionist attitudes toward the Orient were not free of tensions and contradictions, because alongside a rejection of the Orient, pre-1948 Zionists were attracted to it, and as I'm sure we all know. For instance, they were fascinated with the image of the Bedouin as a noble warrior and sought to emulate them, and they contemplated the life of Arab peasants, Talahin, as a window onto biblical times. In short, before 1948, many Zionists viewed the Orient not just as an enemy territory, but also as a utopian space of possibility and renewal. However, for the Jews of Palestine, hashish smoking was a wholly different matter. It amounted to an extreme act of border crossing between Jews and Arabs, and one that would take them far too down the road of Orientalization, thereby exposing Jewish bodies most perilously to the temptations of an alien space, virtually turning them into Arabs. By the way, in much of the same way that English opium users in the late 19th century, Thomas de Quincey is an excellent example of this, right? The author of Confessions of an English Opium Eater. English opium users were deemed as being Orientalized. It's the same process. Historian Ofri Ilani recently showed that during the mandatory period, so-called contraction of sodomy by Jews, and particularly by European Zionists, was described as an especially severe symptom of ideological laxity and the harming effect of the Arab environment. Perhaps second only to sodomy, hashish smoking in Mandatory Palestine was seen as a form of backwardness and barbarism linked to the realities of living among Arabs in the Middle East. This is why such venues as hashish dens, coffee houses, and brothels, in which Arabs and Jews could commingle and assimilate while sharing a hashish-filled hookah, were construed as a national political threat. That these venues were also signaled out as disreputable places of sexual and homosexual encounters is not coincidental. Both represented an Oriental vice not to be transgressed. Just to show you the dangers as it was conceived by Zionists, you could see here crime fiction, which was, of course, directed towards youth and young men. The youth crime fiction, which debuted in Palestine in interwar years, which had also dealt with the dangers of hashish smuggling and hashish consumption. To further dissuade Jews from joining Arabs to become hashish smokers, Zionist public discourse relied on interwar colonial knowledge with a view to asserting that cannabis was a specifically Oriental substance, its special kinds of intoxication being racially compatible with the mentality of Arabs and theirs only. Now, this knowledge arrived in Palestine, as I show in my book, from three main sites: India and Egypt, where the British had contended with cannabis-oriented cultures long before arriving in Palestine, and from the Geneva-based League of Nations, which was one of the main forums in which colonial knowledge about cannabis was produced and exchanged within and across imperial centers. Take, for example, Dr. Jules Bouquet, inspector of pharmacies in Tunis hospitals, and a member of the subcommittee on cannabis appointed by the League of Nations in 1934, who proclaimed, and I quote, "Repeated prohibitions from imams, edicts and penalties from the emirs and sultans, all were in vain. Hashish triumphed and triumphs still, for it is precisely owing to their special mentality that Muslims became and remained devotees of the drug." On another occasion, the very same expert also asserted, and this is important, that cannabis for Oriental increased sexual arousal and caused violent frenzy on the one hand, and indolence and manipulability on the other hand. He concluded by saying that Europeans in North Africa who have had the fancy to try cannabis did not experience these particular effects because cannabis intoxication was, and I quote, "a question of racial I always have this trouble with this word. That cannabis intoxication was a question of racial susceptibility, susceptibility. Please help me out here. A question of racial
susceptibility.
Thank you so much. It was a question of racial susceptibility, or, quote, a question of race receptiveness, thereby, of course, racializing the substance. Interwar Zionist discourse reproduced these ideas and at the same time adapted them to local circumstances. A 1938 commentary in the daily newspaper Davar, the mouthpiece of mainstream Zionism's labor movement and the most popular Hebrew language newspaper in the interwar Palestine, should demonstrate this point. The commentary was published during the 1936-1939 Arab revolt in Palestine, which is rightly considered the most significant anti-colonial insurgency in the Arab Middle East during the interwar period. The writer's primary objective, however, was to repudiate the revolt by reducing its causes and motivations to one overarching cause. And here I quote, Oriental intoxication or poisoning, which is carried on for generations and on a massive scale by means of Oriental drugs. So to substantiate his case, the writer begins by enumerating the effects of hashish intoxication. First, he claims hashish begets powerful erotic feelings, and generally speaking, it increases sexual drives and sexual activity. Second, as the writer goes on to say, hashish induces violent insanity. It begets angry behavior, which can easily reach brutal and fearless aggression. The hashish user, he goes on to say, is easily given to boiling rage and homicide with remarkable cold-heartedness. That is because hashish, quote, stuns his mind, weakens or destroys his recognition of reality, and neutralizes his natural and social inhibitions. Now, compare this to the moral panic of reefer madness and killer weed, right? The moral panic against marijuana in the United States during the interwar period under the leadership of Harry J. Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics at the US Treasury. Again, and you get a sense of the global reverberations of these assertions and in the Davar newspaper. So let us move quickly to the post-1948 era. So I argue that these attitudes, which I've just described to you, the pre-1948 attitudes and notions about the drug, carried on to the post-1948 era, but responded to new demographic and political realities. And what I mean specifically is the expulsion and flight of the Arab population of Palestine on the one hand, and the country's repopulation by Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, collectively known as Mizrahim, on the other hand. Now, some of these Jews, not too many I should add, used hashish in their countries of origin and had brought the habit with them to Israel. Other first and second generation immigrants from Muslim countries were not hashish smokers, but had picked up on the habit in Israel owing to their socio-economic and ethnic marginalizations. These new immigrants, as I'm sure you all know, were settled in transit camps, Ma'abara in singular, Ma'abarot in plural, transit camps which sprang up across the country, with some transformed into development towns by the 1960s. Now, with as their name implies, these settlements were originally perceived as temporary places of dwelling, yet many Jews remained there for much longer periods, between 1 to 7 years. They suffered from poor sanitary and hygiene conditions, poverty and neglect, as well as ill treatment and discrimination by the state. Now, beset by these adversities, transit camps soon evolved into centers of drug wheeling and dealing and substance abuse. And in this way, hashish, for the first time, became a Jewish problem, where formerly it had been considered largely an Arab problem. Now, it is crucial to stress that hashish smoking in Israel remained limited to no more than a few thousand members of the Mizrahi underclass, and did not make inroads into the dominant Ashkenazi middle class until after the 1967 war. Yet there were plenty of moral entrepreneurs for whom hashish-consuming Mizrahim endangered the very Western foundations of the Jewish state, bringing it to the brink of becoming a full-fledged Arab or Levantine space. The primary terms that expressed these fears were contagion and a plague, as though hashish smoking was a virus, was a disease that might spread to the enlightened European, not to say white, sectors of Jewish society in Israel. Now, these metaphors were reminiscent of older mid-19th century continental anxieties of reverse colonialism, which spoke of an insidious invasion of Orientals and Oriental drugs, disrupting metropolitan life by debilitating and immobilizing its citizens. Consider, just for a short example, consider the following ominous warning issued by a police officer in 1956. What we have here, he says, is a national peril, a terrible peril. If something is not done to eliminate this terrible plague, in 10 years' time, Israel will become a second Egypt. Hashish smoking venues, again, where hashish could be shared by Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jews on the one hand and between Jews and Arabs on the other, were especially signaled out as a threat to the homogeneity, Eurocentricity of the nationalist project. That these venues were usually located in Israel's ethnically mixed towns, for example, Jaffa, Acre, Haifa, Elad, which are basically, binational borderlands in which Arabs and Jews live together, heightened the threat of mixedness issuing from them. Mainstream public discourse cast these hashish smoking spaces to the realms of radical alterity. Thus, patrons of these venues were described, and here I'm just a very short, brief collection of statements about these spaces, right? So they were described as worn out and filthy riffraff, the most revolting figures ever seen, a mixture of malignant disease, degeneration, and the underworld, and a prey for bugs and lice, right? The interiors of these establishments were likewise said to be filthy, foul-smelling, depressing, and in a state of utter disrepair. Again, everything in this place is dirty and sticky. The furniture, the glasses, the cups, the thick air hanging in the air. Another example, most of the cafes are very dirty. They are located in ancient ramshackle one-story buildings, in quarters of tin shacks, in pitiable wooden shacks, in plasterless buildings whose entrance yawns before you, bringing to mind toothless old women. Two more examples. The stench is discernible in every corner. The smell of beasts' manure is truly nauseating. Let me conclude. I had a lot more to say, but we are really running out of time, right? So, are we? How much more time do you think I have? Anyone?
Oh, you should start to finish up. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I'll wrap things up. So, global trends and the occupation of Palestine, of Palestinian territories in the 1960 war, joined to prompt a significant expansion of hashish smoking among Israeli Jews that were previously immune to the habit, thus bringing down the ethnic, gender, and class boundaries that kept hashish smoking strictly an Arab or a Mizrahi vice. This process was by no means linear, but it persisted through the 21st century. So in view of this trajectory, a recent op-ed, which was published in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, crowned Israelis as a nation of stoners, Ummah shel Satlanim. Now, admittedly, this description of Jewish Israel as a nation of stoners is surely an overstatement, but a 2017 survey conducted by the Israeli Anti-Drug Authority validates the general impression, picking it up with very hard numbers. The survey found a dramatic surge in the prevalence of cannabis use by Israelis. 27% of the adult population reported using cannabis in the past year, in comparison to just under 9% in 2009. By the way, a comparison with surveys conducted in other countries shows that Israel is probably at the top of cannabis use by adult populations, with Iceland and the US lagging behind at 18 and 16% respectively. In addition, during the very same years, the number of medical cannabis licenses granted in Israel increased from less than 2,000 in 2009 to 28,000 in 2017 and to 60,000 in 2020. So in view of these developments, 2 years ago, the Israeli Department of Justice announced a plan to legalize cannabis for recreational use, but that remains to be seen. But although the normalization of recreational cannabis use in Israel has been gaining steam in recent years, as old mythologies about the substance are losing their credibility, Remnants of obsolete Oriental fantasies about the substance remain in reconfigured form. A blended example of this is a short 33-second video clip prepared by the Israel Anti-Drug Authority in 2006, with which I will conclude. Designed to dissuade teenagers from using intoxicating substances, particularly cannabis, and broadcast on Israel's main public television channel, the clip was produced in the style of the dilettante Less Than Will Testaments videos by Muslim suicide bombers. It shows a teenage boy holding a bong and as a deadly weapon, standing in front of an unsteady camera and reciting the following monologue. I, Omer Kendall, age 16 of Ra'anana, bid goodbye today for my parents Ronit and Shmuel, and for my sister Karen, and am going to a party in Tel Aviv. There is only one way to be truly liberated: to get drunk, take drugs, and get really stoned. Don't cry, Mom. I'm going to paradise. So it is easy to see. In this short clip echoes of Orientalist fantasies about hashish-taking Muslims, which were dressed in early 21st century Islamophobic garb. At the time of the clip's broadcast, the final days of the Second Intifada and the height of President George W. Bush's global war on terror, the suicide bomber had in the US, in Western Europe, and in Israel become emblematic of the so-called Islamic death culture. The clip deliberately played on the strings of these anti-Muslim sentiments that were rampant in Israeli society at the time. At the same time, it drew upon the vocabulary of 19th and early 20th century images of cannabis, namely that hashish is an Oriental substance used by uncivilized Muslim Arab zealots who champion a ritual of death rather than a ritual of life. Whatever the case may be, it appears that the Zionist nightmare of assimilation into the Levant, a nightmare, as we have seen, that haunted Jews in Palestine-Israel since the 1920s, had materialized, at least to the extent that cannabis use is concerned. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you. Really fascinating and really a model of how a subject like this can be discussed at a high level in an academic setting. So really, thank you for bringing it to our audience. And we have some questions. Michelle Doctoroff asks about the role of women in this lifestyle. Your examples, including the unforgettable one at the end, really focused on males, and it's safe to assume that much of the Muslim material was similarly gendered male. What about women?
So shall we collect questions or answer each one?
Well, let's do it one at a time.
Okay, I'll answer that. Well, okay, hashish or cannabis in the Middle East and in Palestine at the time that we are talking about was largely the drug of men. Women, Jews, began to consume cannabis in growing numbers after 1967, which is exactly why my book stops in 1967, because it's a whole different chapter afterward. But hashish is the drug of men. And by the way, one of the reasons which I didn't mention here, much like in the United States at the time, drugs were seen as making men effeminate. which is why, of course, Zionism was, again, one of the reasons why Zionism was so much against the use of drugs in general and cannabis in particular, because it ran in contrast, or it undermined, as it were, the effort, so-called effort to create the new Jew as a fearless man who can defend himself, his family, and his community. But again, throughout the Middle East, Iran, Ottoman Empire, Turkey, Egypt, Palestine-Israel, cannabis was a drug of men. Opium, on the other hand, was much more commonly used by women. But opium in Palestine and Israel, as opposed to, say, the Ottoman Empire in Turkey and Iran, was a much less popular drug, even among the Palestinian Arabs themselves.
We'll have to have another lecture on that subject someday, but we have a question that asks about criminalization of marijuana, certainly in the United States. As marijuana rose, criminalization rose, and that is given as one of the reasons for the enormous jump in the jail population in the United States. And so this perceptive question asks about criminalization of marijuana and hashish in Israel, and what are the tendencies?
Well, first of all, perhaps I should have emphasized this more clearly. Cannabis was criminalized, added to to the list of dangerous drugs such as opium and opiates in 1925. This is when the war on drugs begins. Right? It's not Reagan and it's not Nixon. It is in this interwar period when the League of Nations concludes the second opium convention. This is the moment when the war on drugs begin. By the way, with the full support, and I'm sure most of you have heard of the name, which I also mentioned in my talk, Harry J. Anslinger, who was the first drug czar in the United States, the founder who established the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was succeeded, of course, in 1968 by the DEA. And when we talk about cannabis specifically, well, it had a different trajectory than some other drugs. Most other drugs, opium, heroin, cocaine, right, which began as panaceas. They were looked upon, or they were described as miracle drugs, right, that could solve suffering and so on and so forth. And where only later people or scientists have discovered their negative consequences. Cannabis began the opposite way. It began precisely for the reasons that you can perhaps glean from my talk today. Began as a negative, as a vice, as a satanic drug, right? But only in the past few decades, gradually and slowly gaining a better reputation. So again, this is a global phenomenon, and you can see projects of legalization in many countries, in South America, in the United States, in Europe, and in Israel as well. Israel is a nation of stoners. I mean, 27% of adults, that is a large number, right? And the authorities in Israel, just like elsewhere in the world, are coming to the awareness that prohibition or criminalization is no longer suitable. And thus, incidentally, I think it was 2 weeks ago or a week ago, the Israeli government, the Ministry of Justice, had proclaimed that it would no longer criminalize. It would no longer criminalize recreational use of cannabis, but of course, it has not legalized the sale of cannabis. So what it had done actually, people now no longer in fear that they would be prosecuted, right, would be more than willing to try use, and the only way they can do so is to go to the black market. So this is a sort of an encouragement, right, to the black market. So it really doesn't solve anything in essence, besides the fact that, of course, people would no longer be arrested for cannabis, for recreational use. So I hope that answered your question.
You somewhat brought the story up to the present. I think it was yesterday, the Washington Post ran a story about how kibbutzim in Israel are suddenly moving into the cannabis business. It's become a very lucrative crop, according to the Washington Post. In a way, it's saving agriculture on the kibbutz. The article claims this is all for medical marijuana. But I wondered, since many will have seen the article, if you can comment on it and put it into context.
The saddest thing about it's the same as the United States. The very same people who had previously profited from the war on drugs and from prohibition, very same people are now profiting from this new industrial or the new market of medical marijuana. And I'm talking about past prime ministers, Ehud Barak, for instance. Ehud Barak. There's another, I forgot his name, who's also sent to jail. What was his name? Okay, there are two past prime ministers. There are past senior police officers, right? And the people in the financial world who are now reaping profits, amazing profits. Omer, thank you. Reaping outrageous profits from the booming medical marijuana market. And of course, they themselves are now, if in the past they have emphasized the criminal and the destructive characteristics of cannabis as an evil drug, what the very same people are now doing is trying to camouflage or describe cannabis as a medicine. Therefore, in other words, they are clouding, right, and trying to exercise the negative descriptions, negative attributes of cannabis as a dangerous drug. Yes, and the kibbutzim too. I mean, the kibbutzim have for many years, right, have not been existing, right, as agriculturist hubs, right, as agricultural islands, and they now, they are now been incorporated into the capitalist world, right? They have been privatized, and they're trying to connect themselves with this booming enterprise so as to reap profits, right? But then again, right, this is happening in the United States as well. All of a sudden, the reefer madness, right? The killer weed is no longer a killer weed, but a panacea.
So please join me in thanking Professor Haggai Ram for really an unforgettable lecture, and I encourage you to read his pioneering book. I apologize to those whose questions we didn't get to, but I am going in closing to invite everyone to join us again on March 3rd, when Dr. Tamar Sella, a young ethnomusicologist, will be joining us in this very slot with a seminar entitled Reorienting Diasporic Lineage, Queer and Femme Arab Jewish Performance. Really, again, a broadening of what Israel studies really entails as we seek to expand the borders of this field. So thanks to Professor Ram, thanks to all of you for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'll be sure to join your next lectures. So thank you so much.